The business class cabin hummed with smug confidence, but today the flight was full, leaving no seats in economy. "You'll have to settle here," Amelia Voss, the lead flight attendant, said with a subtle sneer, drawing soft chuckles from a few premium passengers. Sarah Clayton stayed silent, slipping into 12F. But when the plane touched down at Andrews Air Force Base, the F-22 squadron commander paused abruptly, his gaze locking onto her. "Night Falcon, stand up," he declared, his voice commanding. Moments later, every F-22 pilot on the tarmac snapped to attention, saluting her in unison, leaving the cabin in stunned silence. Sarah's hands were steady as she tucked her boarding pass into the pocket of her worn gray hoodie. The Seattle airport had been a whirlwind of noise and chaos, but now, on this packed flight to D.C., each step down the aisle felt deliberate, purposeful. Her hoodie was faded, its cuffs frayed from years of wear, and her jeans had a small rip at the knee, barely noticeable unless someone was hunting for flaws, which it seemed everyone was. She moved carefully down the narrow aisle, avoiding the sleek designer luggage that seemed to flaunt its owner's status. A woman in a sharp blazer, her earrings glinting under the cabin lights, glanced up from her phone with a quick, dismissive smirk. A man in a tailored pinstripe suit, his tie knotted perfectly, leaned toward his companion. "Looks like she missed the bus station," he muttered, loud enough for Sarah to hear. She didn't react. Her steps remained steady, her eyes fixed on the seat numbers above. She wasn't here to prove herself. She just needed to get to D.C. The cabin buzzed with the arrogance of those who thought themselves above others. Business class passengers sipped complimentary drinks, their laughter sharp and self-assured. Sarah settled into 12F, the window seat, sliding her battered army green backpack beneath the seat. A faded patch from a long-forgotten base clung to its surface. The man beside her, mid-40s with a Rolex that screamed new money, gave her a brief, judgmental glance before returning to his tablet. His name tag read Thomas Reed, and his cologne was so strong it made her blink. She didn't care. She'd learned long ago to let disdain roll off her. Her dark, wavy hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, her face bare of makeup. She could have passed for a struggling college student, perhaps someone who'd snagged a last-minute deal. But Sarah was no ordinary traveler. Locked away in a classified file was her record as a reserve recruit, a file that omitted the covert mission she flown for SEAL Team 6 or the murky discharge that followed. A topic too sensitive to be spoken aloud. As Sarah settled in, a woman in a sleek black dress, her hair styled in perfect waves, leaned forward from the row behind. Her name tag read Emily Harper, and her voice carried a practiced sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be so excited to be on a flight like this," she said, her tone heavy with condescension, as if Sarah were a charity case who'd never flown before. A few passengers turned, catching her words, and a soft ripple of laughter spread. Sarah's fingers paused on her water bottle, her thumb brushing the cap. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting Emily's for a fleeting moment. "It's just a plane," she said, her voice quiet but firm, like a stone dropping into a still pond. Emily's smile faltered, and she leaned back with a huff, tossing her hair. Sarah turned to the window, her face impassive, but her grip on the bottle tightened just enough to dent the plastic. "Hey, quick favor before we go on. Grab your phone, hit the like button, and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from or how this story's hitting you. If you've ever been judged or pushed aside, this one's for you. Want more like it? Hit subscribe. It means a lot to share this with you. Now, let's keep moving. The plane hadn't begun taxiing when the first jab landed. Amelia Voss stood at the front of the cabin, her uniform pristine, her smile tight as a wire. She was in her 40s, with sharp eyes that sized people up in seconds and a voice that could cut without rising. She'd glanced at Sarah's boarding pass and made her judgment. "Economy's in the bag," she said, her words edged with just enough contempt to sting. Thomas Reed, the man in the pinstripe suit, leaned toward his friend, a guy with a slick haircut and gold cufflinks. "Probably one of those discount ticket types," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. Sarah's fingers hesitated on her backpack zipper for a split second before she resumed stowing it, her movements slow and deliberate, as if pacing her breaths. A woman across the aisle, her nails glossy red, let out a soft snicker. Sarah didn't look up. She just fastened her seatbelt, her hands steady. The plane climbed into the sky, the engine's hum settling into a steady drone. Sarah gazed out the window, watching clouds drift by like waves. Her hands rested in her lap, calloused from years handling controls and cockpits most would never see. The woman with the glossy nails, Lauren Pierce, leaned toward her friend, a blonde in a silk scarf who smelled of costly perfume. "Bet she's nervous sitting by the emergency exit," Lauren said, her smirk sharp enough to slice through glass. Sarah's lips twitched into a faint smile, but she didn't turn. She reached for her water bottle, twisting the cap with a slow, measured motion. Lauren's friend, Sophie Bennett, laughed, a cutting sound that echoed in the cabin. Sarah stayed silent, her eyes on the horizon, as if searching for something invisible to everyone else. During the meal service, Amelia paused by Sarah's row, holding a tray of business-class menus. She glanced at Sarah's hoodie, then handed a menu to Thomas Reed with a warm smile. "Sorry, we only have enough for our premium guests," she said, her voice carrying, her eyes flicking to Sarah with a hint of superiority. A man in a tailored blazer 2 rows ahead turned back, his low laugh mocking. "Don't worry, she's probably fine with drive-through food," he said, his tone thick with amusement. The cabin rippled with chuckles, and Sarah's hand stilled on her water bottle. She looked up, her eyes meeting Amelia's for a brief moment. "Water's enough," she said, her voice soft but unyielding, like a line drawn in stone. Amelia blinked, caught off guard, then moved on, her heels clicking faster than before. Sarah leaned back, her fingers tapping once against the armrest, a small, controlled gesture that spoke louder than words. Hours passed, the cabin settling into a rhythm of clinking glasses and hushed conversations. Sarah sipped her water, her movements precise, like someone trained to stay composed under pressure. Thomas Reed kept glancing at her, his eyes narrowing as if trying to unravel her. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with condescension. "You look like you're headed to a job interview. Hope you've got a better outfit in that bag." Sarah turned just enough to meet his gaze. "I'm fine," she said, her voice low and steady, like a blade clicking into place. Thomas blinked, thrown off, then muttered something about kids these days, and returned to his tablet. Sarah looked back at the window, her face unreadable, but her fingers adjusted her seatbelt slightly. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the monotony. "Folks, we're making a brief stop at Andrews Air Force Base for refueling. Won't take long." Sarah's head tilted slightly, her eyes sharpening as she glanced at the military runway coming into view. Jets lined the tarmac, their sleek forms gleaming in the sun, personnel moving with purpose below. Her fingers tightened around her water bottle for a moment before she set it down. Amelia, standing nearby, noticed the shift in Sarah's posture. "Something interesting out there?" she asked, her tone more suspicious than curious. Sarah didn't reply immediately. She kept looking out, her hand still in her lap, as if seeing something beyond the other's comprehension. As the plane descended toward Andrews, a businessman in a crisp white shirt, his cufflinks gleaming, stood to grab his bag from the overhead bin. He glanced at Sarah, then spoke loudly to no one in particular. "Some people don't know their place, do they?" he said, his voice laced with smugness. A few passengers nodded, their smiles tight and knowing. Sarah's eyes flicked to him for a moment before returning to the window. She shifted in her seat, her backpack brushing against her leg. "I know exactly where I am," she said, her voice so quiet it barely reached him, but its weight made him pause. He cleared his throat, suddenly engrossed in his bag, and sat down without another word. The cabin grew quieter, the air thick with unspoken judgment. A man in business class, his tie loosened, leaned over his seat. His name tag read Daniel Walsh, and he had the kind of grin that thrived on being the loudest in the room. "What, you think you can fly a plane?" he said, his laugh sharp and cruel. A few passengers chuckled, their laughter like pins pricking the air. Sarah turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto his. "I've been around planes before," she said, her voice calm but resolute, like a door locking shut. Daniel's grin faltered, and he shifted in his seat, suddenly focused on his drink. Amelia raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her heels clicking sharply as she moved down the aisle as if marking the moment. When the plane landed at Andrews, the cabin's energy shifted. Business-class passengers straightened their jackets and checked their phones as if preparing for a boardroom. Amelia's voice came over the intercom, crisp and professional. "A few select passengers have been invited to meet the F-22 pilots on the tarmac. Please remain seated unless notified." Her glance at Sarah made it clear who wasn't included. Sarah didn't move. She took another sip of water, her face expressionless as if she'd heard it all before. Her fingers brushed the edge of her backpack, where a faded eagle patch caught the light briefly before she tucked it away. Lauren Pierce leaned toward her friend, her voice carrying. "They probably don't want photos with someone dressed like that," she said, her laugh sharp and rehearsed. Sophie Bennett nodded, her lips curling into a smirk. A soft chuckle came from the row ahead, where Nathan Brooks, in a designer polo, scrolled through his phone, his smirk visible even from Sarah's seat. She didn't look up. She just twisted the cap back on her water bottle, her movements slow and deliberate, as if measuring the moment. The cabin felt heavier now, the air thick with unspoken disdain. As the invited passengers gathered their belongings, a woman in a designer coat, her perfume sharp and floral, paused by Sarah's row. She looked down at Sarah, her eyes narrowing, and spoke to Amelia in a stage whisper. "You'd think they'd vet passengers better for flights like this," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. Amelia nodded slightly, her lips pursed, and handed the woman a complimentary drink. Sarah's hand stilled on her backpack, her fingers brushing the faded eagle patch. She looked up, her eyes meeting the woman's for a split second. "Screening's not my issue," she said, her voice low and even, like a quiet challenge. The woman froze, her drink halfway to her lips, then hurried back to her seat. Sarah leaned back, her expression unchanged, but her fingers tapped once against the armrest, a small, controlled motion. Sarah's eyes flicked to the window, where the F-22s stood like sentinels on the tarmac. For a moment, her fingers paused, hovering over the patch on her backpack. She'd sewn it on years ago, after a mission that left her hands trembling but her squadron alive. The memory surged unbidden, a night sky streaked with tracer fire, the roar of engines, the weight of choices no one should face. She blinked, and the memory faded. She adjusted her hoodie, pulling the sleeves over her hands, and leaned back in her seat. The cabin's chatter felt distant, like static on a radio. Major Ryan Caldwell stepped into the business-class cabin, his uniform crisp, his presence like a storm rolling in. He was in his late 30s, with a jawline like carved stone and eyes that missed nothing. He greeted the invited passengers with a polite nod, shaking hands with Thomas Reed and Lauren Pierce. But then his gaze landed on Sarah, seated quietly in 12F. He froze, his hand lingering on the last handshake. The cabin didn't notice at first, but Sarah did. She met his eyes, her expression steady, as if she'd been expecting this. Her fingers brushed the edge of her seat, a small grounding gesture. Caldwell walked directly to her row, his boots heavy against the floor. "Are you Shadow Eagle 12?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Sarah gave a slight nod, her eyes unwavering. Thomas Reed snorted softly, as if it were a joke. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from Sarah. "My apologies for seating you here," he said, louder now, for the entire cabin to hear. "You're invited to the tarmac immediately." Sarah stood, slinging her backpack over one shoulder. Her movements were smooth, precise, like she'd done this countless times. The cabin hummed with whispers, but she didn't look back. As she followed Caldwell toward the exit, a man in a navy suit, his watch glinting under the cabin lights, leaned out of his seat. "This has to be a mistake," he said, his voice loud and confident, like he was addressing a boardroom. "She doesn't look like anyone important." A few passengers nodded, their murmurs growing louder. Sarah's steps didn't falter, but her hand tightened on her backpack strap, her knuckles whitening briefly. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. "Looks can fool you," she said, her voice soft but sharp, like a blade slicing through silk. The man's mouth opened, then closed, and he sat back, his confidence deflated. Caldwell's eyes flicked to the man, a silent warning, before he led Sarah out. Outside, the air was sharp with jet fuel and wind. Sarah stepped onto the tarmac, her hoodie flapping slightly. The F-22 pilots stood in a straight line, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. Caldwell's voice cut through the silence. "Attention. This is Night Falcon, the one who once led 3 squadrons through enemy skies." The pilots snapped to attention, their hands rising in perfect unison to salute her. Sarah returned the salute, her movements crisp, her expression calm but warm. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she lowered her hand. The wind carried the moment, and the cabin windows filled with faces watching. Sarah's eyes flicked to the jets, and for a moment her shoulders relaxed as if she were home. Back on the plane, the mood had shifted. Thomas Reed scoffed, leaning back in his seat. "Sounds like something out of a movie," he said, his voice carrying over the engine's hum. Amelia gave a forced chuckle. "Maybe it's just an honorary title," she said, smoothing her uniform. Sophie Bennett whispered to Lauren, "No way it's real." Sarah didn't look at them. She stood by the window, her hands in her pockets, watching the jets gleam under the sun. Caldwell's glance toward the cabin was icy, as if he'd heard every word. Sarah's fingers brushed the edge of her hoodie, a small grounding motion, before she turned back to the tarmac. A young officer approached, carrying an old flight helmet, worn but well-maintained. The call sign Night Falcon was embroidered in bold letters across the side. Caldwell took it and held it out to Sarah. "This helmet is only awarded to a pilot who's completed a top-secret mission," he said, his voice steady but loud enough for the cabin to hear. Sarah took the helmet, her fingers tracing the stitching for a moment. Then she slipped it on, her movements as natural as breathing. The fit was perfect, like it had been crafted for her. A young pilot, barely out of his 20s, stepped forward, his voice low. "She's the one who saved my squadron," he said. The other pilots straightened, their faces shifting to something like awe. As Sarah stood on the tarmac, a junior pilot, his face still boyish under his cap, approached hesitantly. He held a small weathered logbook, its edges frayed from use. "Ma'am, you signed this for me 3 years ago," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He opened it to a page marked with her call sign, her signature sharp and unmistakable. The other pilots turned, their eyes softening with recognition. Sarah took the logbook, her fingers brushing the page. She nodded, her lips pressing into a small, genuine smile. "You made it through," she said, her voice quiet but warm. The pilot's eyes shone, and he stepped back, saluting again. The cabin windows were still crowded with faces, but the air felt different now, heavier with something unspoken. Sarah stepped back into the cabin, the helmet tucked under her arm. The passengers were quieter now, but not all were convinced. Amelia forced a smile, her voice overly polite. "Well, it's nice to have a special guest," she said, but her eyes flicked to Sarah's scuffed sneakers. Nathan Brooks crossed his arms, his voice low but clear. "Probably just a PR stunt," he muttered. Sarah didn't respond. She just bowed her head slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the helmet. The cabin was split. Some watched her with curiosity, others with skepticism. She didn't care either way. She settled back into 12F, her backpack at her feet, and looked out the window. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a younger flight attendant approached Sarah's row with a nervous smile. She held a small pin, a silver eagle, and offered it to Sarah. "This is from the crew for, your service," she said, her voice stumbling over the words. The cabin grew quiet, all eyes on the exchange. Sarah looked at the pin, then at the attendant's face. She took it, her fingers careful, and pinned it to her backpack without a word. The attendant smiled, a real smile this time, and hurried back to her station. Nathan Brooks shifted in his seat, his earlier smirk gone. Sarah leaned back, her eyes on the window, the pin glinting faintly in the cabin light. The plane taxied back to the runway, preparing for takeoff. Sarah's fingers tapped lightly against the helmet in her lap, a slow, steady rhythm. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but before he could finish, another sound cut through a low, powerful roar. 2 F-22s appeared alongside the plane, their wings glinting in the sunlight. Caldwell's voice crackled over the radio, clear for everyone to hear. "Night Falcon, we never got to thank you for last time." Sarah leaned toward the window, her lips curving into a small smile. She pressed the headset she'd been given and spoke, her voice steady. "Hold formation, Eagle One." The response came instantly, a chorus of voices over the radio. "Yes, ma'am." The cabin went silent. Thomas Reed froze, his drink halfway to his mouth. Lauren Pierce stared at her phone, her fingers still. Amelia's smile vanished, her hands fumbling with a tray. No one spoke. The F-22s stayed in formation, escorting the plane as it climbed into the sky. Sarah leaned back in her seat, her eyes on the jets outside. The cabin was a different place now. No one looked at her the same way. Daniel Walsh, the loud man with the loosened tie, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado gone. Sophie Bennett whispered something to Lauren, but it was too quiet to hear. Sarah didn't need to hear it. She'd heard enough. As the plane leveled off, a passenger in a tailored jacket, his face flushed with embarrassment, stood and approached Sarah's row. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his voice low but audible to those nearby. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier." Sarah looked up, her eyes steady but not unkind. She nodded once, a small acknowledging gesture, and turned back to the window. The man stood there for a moment, his hands fidgeting, before returning to his seat. The cabin felt smaller now, the air charged with a mix of awe and shame. Sarah's fingers brushed the eagle pin on her backpack, a quiet reminder of who she was. The flight to D.C. felt shorter after that. The cabin stayed quiet, the earlier chatter replaced by an uneasy hum. Sarah kept her eyes on the window, watching the F-22s peel away as the plane approached its final descent. Her fingers brushed the patch on her backpack again, the faded eagle catching the light. She'd been 19 when she earned it, flying a mission so classified even her team didn't know the full scope. The sky had been chaos, the radio screaming with orders, but she'd brought them home, every single one. She blinked, and the memory faded, replaced by the D.C. skyline coming into view. When the plane landed, the passengers moved slowly, as if still processing what they'd witnessed. Sarah stood, slinging her backpack over her shoulder, the helmet tucked under her arm. She didn't rush or linger. She just walked down the aisle, her step steady, her head high. Thomas Reed avoided her eyes, his phone pressed to his ear as he muttered something about a meeting. Lauren Pierce was typing furiously, her face pale. Amelia stood by the exit, her smile forced, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Sarah didn't look at any of them. She just kept moving, her sneakers silent against the floor. At the gate, a man was waiting. He was tall, quiet, with a presence that didn't need words. His suit was simple but tailored, and his eyes locked onto Sarah the moment she appeared. He didn't say much, just nodded and fell into step beside her. The passengers from the flight, still lingering at baggage claim, went quiet. Nathan Brooks dropped his phone mid-text, his smirk gone. Sophie Bennett looked away, her scarf clutched tightly in her hand. Amelia busied herself with paperwork, her movements jerky. No one needed to say his name. They knew who he was. Michael Clayton, Sarah's husband, a man whose influence reached places most couldn't fathom. Before they left the terminal, a young girl, maybe 10, tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at Sarah. "Is that the pilot lady?" she whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The mother, a quiet woman who'd stayed silent during the flight, looked at Sarah and nodded. "That's her," she said softly, her voice full of respect. Sarah caught the girl's eye and gave a small, warm smile, the kind that said she saw her. The girl grinned back, clutching her mother's hand tighter. Sarah's hand brushed Michael's as they walked on, the helmet still under her arm, the eagle pin glinting faintly. The terminal was bustling, but people parted as they passed, as if sensing something greater than the faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers. The fallout came swiftly, silent but unyielding. Thomas Reed, the pinstripe-suited executive, was a mid-level manager at a defense contractor. Someone on the flight had recorded his snide remarks, and the video spread across the internet like wildfire. By the next morning, he was jobless, his LinkedIn profile wiped clean. Lauren Pierce, the influencer with the glossy nails, saw her latest sponsorship deal collapse after the video went viral. Her follower count plummeted by thousands overnight, her apology post drowned in a sea of critical comments. Amelia Voss faced a quieter reckoning, a formal reprimand from the airline for unprofessional behavior. She was reassigned to short domestic routes, her dreams of international flights grounded indefinitely. Emily Harper's social media presence took a hit when her company distanced itself from her, citing unprofessional conduct. Nathan Brooks's startup lost a major investor, the news breaking quietly but decisively. Sophie Bennett's law firm issued a public apology for her behavior, and she was sidelined from high-profile cases. Daniel Walsh's consulting firm dropped him from their roster, his name erased from their website by the week's end. Sarah didn't witness any of this unfold. She didn't need to. She'd faced worse than their words missions, where the sky was a blaze of fire, where a single misstep meant no return. This was just noise, the kind she'd long ago learned to tune out. She and Michael walked through the terminal, their steps in sync, the helmet still under her arm. The D.C. skyline loomed outside, a reminder of why she was here, not for the passengers, not for the recognition, but for something greater, something that had always driven her, even when the world tried to diminish her. In the end, Sarah stood at the edge of the tarmac, her husband beside her, the city stretching out before them. The wind tugged at her hoodie, but she didn't pull it tighter. She stood steady as she always had. The world had doubted her, mocked her, tried to make her feel out of place, but she was never small. She never had been. And for anyone who'd ever been judged, overlooked, or silenced, her story was a quiet promise. You're not alone. You never were. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and hit follow to join me through stories of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately healing.